Welcome back to Israel Matters. I'm here again. I'm Rabbi Pesach Wolicki, and I'm here again, of course, with Elliot Chodoff.
Hi, Pesach.
How you doing, Elliot?
Good. How are you?
Elliot, I've really been gaining a lot from these. When we first decided to do them, I was like, oh yeah, we'll talk about stuff with Israel, and being someone who lives in Israel and has been deeply involved, of course, in Israel advocacy, and I'm Israeli. I thought that I wouldn't learn that much, but I've been learning a tremendous amount from you, and I just think this has been really good for me personally, as well as I'm sure for all those who are watching these. So I wanted to just thank you, at the start of our seventh episode, and we will go much. We had a conversation before we started recording that we are going to start going much more deeply into the background of Israel's issues with its neighbors and the ideologies that underlie those positions, which is, I think, much more valuable than the surface, shallow understanding that we get just from watching the news.
Yes.
So we'll get to that soon. But before we get to that, I just wanted to comment on the fact that I'm unshaven. This is beyond stubble, and I am not attempting to grow a beard. I know, Elliot, you look kind of the same because you wear a beard.
Right.
I just want to explain to all those who are watching this why I'm not shaving. We are right now in the period between the 17th of Tammuz, which was about a week and a half ago,
Yes.
and the 9th of Av. And that period, the 9th of Av, is the anniversary of the destruction of the temple. Actually, both temples were destroyed on the same date, the 9th of Av. And numerous other tragedies in Jewish history happened on that day. 3 weeks before that is the 17th of Tammuz, which was the beginning of the siege on the city of Jerusalem before the destruction of the temple. And the period of
the breaching of the walls, wasn't it?
Sorry, the breaching of the walls. You're right. The siege began in the wintertime, and that was on the 10th of Tevet. Thank you for the correction. The 17th of Tammuz was when the siege was broken, and the Romans entered the city of Jerusalem and started ransacking it and murdering people, and which ultimately culminated in the destruction of the temple. So this 3-week period is a period of mourning, a period of historical reflection, for Jews, and we mark it in a number of ways. And one of the ways in which we mark it is there's a custom to not shave, to kind of let our appearance go a little bit as a sign of lack of happiness, of just marking it in that way. So that's why I'm not shaven, and I think this is part of an issue that maybe we'll discuss in a later episode about the importance of historical awareness and historical memory to Jewish identity, and history plays, I believe, a very profound role in Jewish identity, which might be a little different than the role that history plays for other peoples and other cultures. Anyway, so that's just that's my explanation of why I'm unshaven. I apologize for my appearance, but let it be a reminder to all of us that there are some things in this world that still need fixing, and Jerusalem and the temple being right there at the top of the list. So, Elliot, as I said in the opening, we're going to delve a little deeper into what's going on with Iran. Just before we do that, I want to mention that all these explosions that we talked about last time, where Iran is getting attacked, maybe by somebody, we had 7 explosions. People shouldn't think that it stopped. Again, you're not seeing this in the news. You turn on Fox or CNN or whatever, or open up your newspaper, you're not going to see news of explosions in Iran. But just yesterday, here we go again. Just yesterday, there was an explosion. This time, apparently,
that's right. Another one.
A major pipeline. Could you just talk about that for a moment before we get into the further background? You could just take it from there.
Sure. Well, the reports were that a major oil pipeline in southern Iran blew up. The flames were visible to anybody and everybody. When oil pipelines blow up, they make rather spectacular pyrotechnics.
Well, I would imagine they also continue to burn.
Well, if it's a pipeline part of a system, they can shut off the flow of oil, so they can. Let's say it's not as bad as it looks in the sense of overall destruction. It looks spectacular, but it's not the same, let's say, as a refinery blowing up, like what the Iranians did to the Saudis, where there's major infrastructure damage and that sort of thing. here, oil burns. I mean, obviously there was a loss, there was damage, but on a pipeline, they just shut off the flow, wait till it burns out, and they'll fix whatever segment needs to be fixed. But it looks bad. It's another sort of poke, whether it's from inside or outside, whoever's behind it. And you know what? Even if they're all accidents, which I don't believe, it doesn't look good for a system to have that many accidents one after another.
So
it's like
it's some kind of weakness. It's either a weakness,
exactly,
on a security level, or it's a weakness in terms of infrastructure and management. Either way,
something's wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that's ongoing. And really what we talked about, and I think what we should be focusing on, is not so much the tracking of the daily events, because tomorrow there'll be something else in 2 days or 3 days and 5 days. And that's important. I'm certainly not one to argue that we shouldn't be following the news and keeping track of things. But I actually want to sort of pick up off the last thing you just said before about the importance of the studying of history and that sort of thing. There's a famous quote that is most often misquoted by George Santayana. The actual quote is, "He who cannot remember the past is condemned to repeat it." That's the actual verbatim quote. It's from a book called The Life of Reason, which was written about 115 years ago. I'm actually one of the few people, I think, who've actually read the book, as opposed to misquoting the line. The context of the quote is interesting too, and I think if understand, I'm very much into context, and I think my friends know that. The context changes and actually gives the quote much more power, because it comes from the section of the book where he talks about change and progress. And he says, and now I'm paraphrasing, that people mistakenly think that progress is a function of change, where in fact progress is a function of memory. Because he who cannot remember, right? Because he who cannot remember the past is condemned to repeat it. In other words, you're going to make the same mistake over and over again unless you know what happened before. And I'll add to that, before we go into the deep history here. The people, very often the mistakes made in history, and you know what, I think for many of us, even in personal lives, there are stupid mistakes, don't get me wrong, but many of the mistakes are mistakes made by misassessing variables, misassessing values, things that are not obvious when you're making the decisions, and only in retrospect turn out to be mistakes. And then in retrospect say, oh, here's where the flaw was in my logic in the decision making. And if you don't have that memory, you're likely to make that same mistake again. But with the memory, you say, oh, wait a minute. Last time I did this looked like the right decision, but it was the wrong one. Now I know that this is not the right decision. So that's the importance of remembering the past.
Wow. So if I could just react to that for a moment, it's an even deeper statement than it appears on the surface, because what he's saying is that I'll put it this way. Often people have this idea that to move forward, to progress, we have to wipe away the past. We have to forget about the past, and we're forward thinking. We're not thinking about, and it's really just the opposite. The more immersed you are in knowledge and awareness of the past, the more effectively you can progress.
Correct.
Because of that knowledge. That's
correct. Otherwise, you end up reinventing the wheel. So, having said that, now let's go back a little bit. We read in a lot of the reports and the commentary on Iran, all sorts of speculation. Will they reform under these circumstances? Will they change? Will they moderate? There's a whole hierarchy, especially when Iranian elections come around. These are the moderate candidates, and these are the more extremist candidates, and all sorts of Western relativity that's built into that. And I think it's really important for us to understand where Iran comes from, and with Iran, all of its sort of its spawns. Not just it has allies that are not spawns of Iran, but Hezbollah certainly is. Some of the other groups certainly are. And understanding where they come from is really important in reading what's going on. So for that, we need to go back really to Khomeini in the 60s and 70s. But in order to understand Khomeini, just a very, very quick back step as well. Traditionally, Shiites, and I'm not going to go into the whole Sunni Shiite thing here. Let's take it at face value. The Shiites are a sect within Islam. And it's a population that sees themselves, actually, the word Shiite comes from the same as the Hebrew word Siyah, which is a faction. Mm-hmm. Okay, so they see themselves as a faction within Islam. Traditionally, for a whole bunch of historical reasons, the Shiite communities around the world, I mean, primarily the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, that area out to Lebanon, were somewhat independent in their decision-making, in the sense that I'm going to use a very loose analogy here, similar to the Jewish diaspora, where communities, I'm thinking, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about European or Mizrahi, largely for reasons of technology, would have a local rabbi, and the local rabbi was the one who was the authority. He may have had some contact with some higher authority, but 99% of what went on was done locally in terms of community decision-making. And the same was true with the Shiites, for entirely different reasons, but nonetheless, that was the case. They have a belief that everything will change when the hidden imam, the 12th imam, who disappeared, went into hiding, will reappear. And again, a very, very loose analogy here, and it's not a good one, but just to help in understanding, a messianic kind of a concept. Khomeini comes along in the 1960s and develops a new theory, which is ultimately published in a book in 1970, which it's available today. You can look it up online and get it free in a PDF. That's translated into English as Islamic government. In Persian, it's Waliyat al-Faqih. And Islamic government has a couple of interesting things in it. The first is that Khomeini argues that you can establish an Islamic Shiite state prior to the reappearance of the Imam, of the 12th Imam. Okay.
Well, that's fascinating. I never knew this. It seems to have an analogy with the internal debate within Judaism.
Correct.
About whether there can be a Jewish state prior to the arrival of the Messiah. That's correct. That's very interesting.
Correct. But he takes it a step further, because he is a centralist, he's political, he's a revolutionary, theological as well as political. And he argues that when that happens, the supreme leader of that independent Islamic state, Shiite, becomes the leader of all Shiites. In other words, there's now a centralized, not only government, but theological authority. And the jurist, it's called the jurist. And when he comes to power in 1979, he puts that into play. Now, here, when it happened, I remember it. Nobody understood this. Nobody knew this. Today, very few people understand. But his idea of we've established an Islamic Republic was revolutionary theologically, and it was also revolutionary politically, because he then declared himself to be the supreme authority over all Shiites in the world.
Did the rest of the Shiite diaspora, as it were, accept this theological turn?
Not universally. In other words, to this day, and here's a very important side note, when all the commentaries talk today, the talking heads talk about the Sunni Shiite conflict, divide, split, they miss the point that within Shiism there is also a split. There are Khomeinists and non-Khomeinists. And I'm talking about on very high levels theologically, not just run-of-the-mill. So it's not a simple Sunni Shiite thing, but what it means is that those who are Khomeinists believe in the authority, the absolute authority of Khomeini as the last word on everything. Because as they say, Khomeini writes this, as does Naim Qassem, who's the number 2 of Hezbollah, who wrote a very important work on Hezbollah, in other words, a revealing work about his own organization. So you cannot separate religion and politics. Okay, this is the antithesis of the Protestant idea that America is built on, basically. Separation of religion and state. It's inseparable. You can't. Religion is politics and politics is religion. And the supreme leader is simultaneously the supreme religious authority and the supreme political authority. Now, what's important in addition to that sort of structural point is that in the second paragraph of page 1 of Islamic government, Khomeini says the Jews have always been the enemy of Islam. Now, just for a superficial comparison, it took Hitler 21 pages in Mein Kampf before he got to the Jews.
Second paragraph of page 1.
Correct. Cut to the chase.
Right.
And then he goes into, I mean, it follows very much Mein Kampf-like. It's the Jews are, not the settlements and not the policies, and it's not, Israel can't exist because it's Jewish, period. And its destruction is preordained, it's an absolute, because it's Jewish, and Jews are the enemy of Islam, and they always have been. This is, I remind you, this is the book Islamic Government. Okay. Another thing that he writes about in Islamic government, and that's important because a lot of people have heard this term and misunderstand it, is the concept of taqiyya. Taqiyya is commonly discussed as the Muslim or the Islamic permission to lie to your enemies. So, you know what? I hate to break this to everybody. Everybody lies to their enemies. You don't need to be a Muslim. Jews lie to their enemies. Christians lie to their enemies. It's called deception. The scripture tells us to make war by deception. In other words, there's nothing unique in the translation of taqiyya as lying to your enemies, but that's not what it means. Khomeini is very clear that that's not what it means. Taqiyya is when a Muslim authority makes a religious ruling for the purpose of deceiving the enemy about what Islam is about. In other words, when Khomeini and later Khamenei said, it is against Islamic law to have nuclear weapons, that's taqiyya. In other words, an authority making, and you'll find it all over the apologist Iranian literature. Iran can't have nuclear weapons because the supreme leader said it's against Islamic law. Khomeini in his book talks about that specifically. He says that is permitted, and it's something that particularly from a Jewish perspective in our history, how many times have rabbinical authorities been faced with threat, life and death threat, and refused to issue halachic rulings that were against halakha simply to save themselves or their lives. In other words, there's a religious dividing line. that Khomeini says doesn't exist on their side.
Wow, so treating the Islamic Republic of Iran as a regular political entity that is governed by your kind of standard strategic political motives is misguided, and it's just not. It's a recipe for failure.
Yes. Okay. Here, and this is true in the literature on Hezbollah as well. There is often confusion between motives and objectives on the one hand, and strategy on the other hand. Okay? And shifts in strategy simply mean that people are thinking. They don't necessarily mean shifts in objectives. Your strategy can change, and Edward Luttwak, the great strategist, American strategist, in his book on strategy, points out that strategy is actually paradoxical logic in many cases. In other words, you do the opposite of what it seems you want in order to get what you want, and not from necessarily a point of view of deception. The example that he brings in his introduction is that during the Roman imperial period, there was a saying, some people may be familiar with it, in the Latin or the English, "Civit pacem para bellum." He who wants peace prepares for war. Okay, it's rather commonly known. And we take it at face value, but that's a paradox, right? One would think, linear logic would say, he who wants peace makes peace, prepares for peace. Now, we know that the world doesn't work that way, and therefore, if you want peace, you have to be prepared to go to war. That's a paradox. So, when Iran does something, and when it's, as I said, it spawns like Hezbollah do something, there could be a strategic logic that makes what they're doing look like the exact opposite of what they're trying to accomplish. And here I say again, not because of deception, but because of the nature of strategy. And a shift to a different strategy when one strategy isn't succeeding doesn't mean a shift in motives or in objectives. Okay? Now, in order to bring this up to date and maybe sort of throw an intro into our next conversation, let's remember that the current supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, took over from or after Khomeini's death. In other words, between 1979 and today, there have only been 2 leaders in Iran.
That's amazing. That's 41 years.
Right. Okay. And the continuity there is far tighter, because obviously every time a new person comes in, there's a bit of a shift. There has to be, they're not identical. Even if they're devoted, loyal followers, there's going to be some sort of a few degrees shift. So if over 40 years you've had how many presidents? Since Carter, right? They're shifting, just even leaving the 2-party system and the difference between Democrats and Republicans. Here you don't have it. And the continuity of that line is very, very solid and very strong. What I'm going to throw out for our next conversation is the fact that Hezbollah, since its inception in 1982, has only had 3 leaders. And one of them, the current one, Nasrallah, for well over 20 years. All 3 of the leaders of Hezbollah were clerics, all Khomeiniist, all received their clerical, call it ordination for lack of a better term, from the Khomeini schools in Iraq. Okay. In other words, they are and they are absolute Khomeiniists in terms of Islamic government, the jurisprudence of the leadership.
The theology, meaning the theology is
of Waliyat al-Faqih. That's right. In other words, when when Khamenei gives Nasrallah an order, it's not the order of a patron to a client, as many people believe.
Or of even
It's
a
the
government,
order of
or
the
of even a
highest.
superior. It's not even just like a government superior or even a military commander. It's beyond that.
That's right. That's right. It's a religious authority speaking to a subordinate.
It's a papal edict. Yeah.
It's a papal edict to a cardinal.
To a direct subordinate. Right. Wow.
Okay. In other words, it's not, by the time it gets down to the individual in the parish, it can be watered down along the way. But the order that's coming directly here is from the authority to a religious authority. Remember that Sayyid Nasrallah he's a religious authority in his own right. And he's directly subordinate to the supreme leader in Iran.
Wow. Okay. So this is fascinating, and what you've done here is essentially open things up a crack. So now we have some basis for further discussion. But this is a game changer. I mean, for anyone listening to this, myself included, and I've been involved in the Middle East my whole life, and this is brand new to me. And I think that what you've done here is set the stage with this paradigm shift, that now when we talk about Iran and we start talking about the details of this background and continue with this next time, we're doing it on the basis of an understanding of where these people are coming from. And I think that maybe in our subsequent episodes, we should start by telling people to go back and watch this one, right. Just to make sure that we know what we're talking about. I guess I'll just end on this note. It makes me wonder if the people in the U.S. State Department who are responsible for dealing with Iran are fully cognizant of the nature of this ideological and religious basis for how they view things, because it would seem that they should be expert in this and know all of this, but at the same time, the behavior of the U.S. State Department, especially in the previous administration, seemed to, based on what you're saying, it sounds like they were behaving as though they were not aware of this.
Yes, and you know what? Maybe next time, before we go into the ramifications of it here, in terms of Hezbollah and the followers and that sort of thing, it might pay to spend a few minutes talking about how the West in general, Western academia, and of course the State Department comes out of academia, has completely missed the boat in understanding what religion means in terms of decision making.
That would be great. Okay, on that note, let's call it a day here, and we'll resume this next week. This is fascinating. This really give us a deeper understanding. I just find that when I read the news, if it's a story that I know a lot about, I'm sure everyone watching this has had this experience. When you know a lot about the background of a story, you read the news and you get frustrated because of how shallow it is. And when you don't know the background, you think you're getting all the information you need. So I think the more we know about this, the more we're going to be able to read between the lines. And again, it always comes back to, what are we praying for? What are we working towards when we lobby our elected officials, being more knowledgeable than the media and then the shallow talking heads around us. This is what we're here for. So thank you again, Elliot, and thank you everyone for
Thank you, Pesach.
And please share this with people. Let people know that there's somewhere to go to get really in-depth and detailed understanding of what's actually going on in the Middle East with those things that matter most to Israel, and tell them about Israel Matters. Have a good day, everyone. Have a good week.